I will start with monogamy, then commitment, and then I will have the marriage.
The marriage comes with commitment, ma'am. Unless you'd like something on the side.
Oh, no.
Good choice, ma'am. And for you, sir?
Just a side order of sacks, please.
Welcome. I'm Ben Boyce, and I'm back. It's been a minute, but I finally had 30 minutes to try and stuff all my thoughts about something that's been on my mind into a single episode, hopefully without muddling everything into pig slop ice cream, my mom's nickname for what it looks like when you mix all three flavors of Neapolitan ice cream together with some milk. Yum. And maybe that's what this episode should be called, pig slop. I kind of like that. Okay, so here's the setup. A few months ago, I was at a prison education conference in Cleveland, and I gotta say, Cleveland, I was pretty surprised. We're in the heart of downtown at both the Marriott and the Hilton, 2 blocks from the Browns Stadium and 3 blocks from Lake Erie, but it didn't feel like a typical downtown. It was clean, traffic was pretty light, and it was actually pretty affordable. Plus, it was green. In Colorado, that's becoming a little less common. So, Cleveland, what's up? I'll see you again soon. Although the drug market was kind of shit, but that's for a different episode. So, day one of the conference was when my group presented, 7 of us in various roles in our Colorado prison education program, along with 2 currently incarcerated people, a student and a teacher. And that's right, in Colorado we have incarcerated people who we hire to teach. So after this presentation, I wound up having a conversation with somebody about my work, their work, and some other basic nice-to-meet-you stuff. But as often happens in these conferences, we bumped into each other a few more times and had some convos. And during one of those, which in hindsight was probably due in part to me flirting, I mentioned something about monogamy not having a moral leg to stand on. I think I asked it as a question, something like, is there actually any moral argument for monogamy in 2026? Or do they all just come down to, I'm an evolved creature, a human, and one of the things we've evolved with is jealousy, which served some sort of purpose a long time ago, before birth control and feminism and protection and conferences, society. But I still just like the idea of owning my partner's sexuality. Like, is that the entire argument? If that's the only reason, and I'm pretty sure that aside from religious reasons, which strike me as even less rational than because I don't like how it makes me feel to think about my partner having sex with someone else, I think that is the only reason. And if that is the only reason, then there really isn't a good moral argument for monogamy in 2026. And just to get the obvious out of the way, consent might be on your mind here. Maybe the fact that your partner wants you to be monogamous and you consented to be monogamous, maybe that presents a moral argument, right? And I'm inclined to agree with that line of argument, although just below the surface of it lies the more important question. What was your consent based on? What was the real reason you said yes? And again, it always seems to boil down to either religious reasons that don't work without a God being concerned about who does who in what position, or to I own your sexuality reasons, which might have made sense 10,000 years ago, but really don't anymore. So consent in your word matter. I'm not saying you should just start cheating on your partner, and it would be cheating if you don't talk about it first. But I'm saying that whether you've looked closely to figure out why you feel compelled to be monogamous or not, the actual reason is almost certainly one of the 2 I just listed. It's either because I want to control my partner's sexuality, or it's a religious argument. You can live that way if you want, but I'm good. I deal with enough self-enforced repression as it is, so I'll pass on that one. Now, by the way, if you're freaking out right now, like, Ben, what the fuck? I thought you were married. I am. 20 years, which is wild. How'd that happen? And we're happy. She's the shit. We get along. I love her. We have great conversations and even greater sex. All's well at home. But we're also feminist, and we both really try to practice what we preach. So that means we've had lots of talks about how our sexual identity should work and how we want to deliberately build our relationship to protect each other while also, being humans. And as feminists and cultural critics, It's also important for us to question everything we were taught to just take for granted as kids, because in the religious settings where we were both raised, a lot of the programming we got was fucking poison. I've actually talked about some of this before on the show. One episode way back I did with Dr. Stephanie Webb was about polyamory, so if you want to know more about how to build those sorts of relationships, check that out. Although I'm not polyamorous, at least not by definition. But the short story is, we made our own custom set of rules with an emphasis on honesty to each other, consent, protecting each other, and that's basically it. No big deal. So back to this conference. As I'm pushing my new friend and her coworker for an answer, like, do y'all think there's even a moral argument for monogamy today? This other guy who's been sitting there and probably realized what was going on, I believe the technical term is cockblocking, he spoke up and basically said, what are you talking about? Morality doesn't exist, not without some framework. And he did it in that way that made me immediately realize, oh shit, this is one of those smart assholes who makes me feel like a dipshit. Great. I'm sure you know that experience. If you don't know that experience, then you're probably one of the assholes. I'm over here rocking out with my B+ smarticles, talking about a recipe or the weather or some theory Foucault came up with 50 years ago. And the next thing I know, some asshole's dragging quantum physics into the convo and breaking everybody's brain by talking in a way that only smart people talk. Ugh. Actually, I could probably have a decent conversation about quantum physics, but that's also for a different episode. So I engaged with this dude and I tried to keep up. In all honesty, I'm actually also pretty equipped for a deep philosophical conversation about morality. Surprise. And the argument he was making seemed to be something like what Alasdair MacIntyre and Thomas Nagel said 40 years ago, that you can't have a moral view from nowhere. All that means is that morality is a human invention, and that its definition depends very much on what the hell a human is. If humans never had to eat, or if we didn't require clean water for regularly drinking, well, then morality would look very different when, say, making a decision about how we ought to deal with a group of people nearby who have no food or water. If they don't need food or water to survive or thrive, then who cares? If they require both food and water to survive or thrive, we suddenly have to figure out what we ought to do, a moral question, if we have the option to either provide them with it or to let them starve to death. What a human is matters. It's the only way the concept of morality makes any sense at all. Morality literally just means using a list of facts to decide what one ought to do in a given situation. Now, if you're a philosophy geek, like I am, or if you've just heard me talk about this before, you might be thinking, hold on, Ben, hasn't it been like 300 years since David Hume explained why you can't get an ought from an is? Of course, this word salad, oughts from is's, it sounds way more confusing than it is, but Hume was just saying that facts don't compel anyone to do anything. They're just fucking facts. And he's saying that anyone who says otherwise is almost certainly using their preferred perspective as a business owner, a preacher, a religious person, your parents, to try to force your average citizen to do things that don't benefit others as much as they benefit the person pressing those values on you as morals, as much as they benefit the guy saying capitalism exists, an is statement, therefore we ought to solve problems by purchasing commodities, an ought statement. Hume said that's not how reasoning works. Facts about the world are just facts. And even though they might cause different people with different perspectives to come to different conclusions about what they each want to do, what will benefit each of them the most in the moment, those facts in no way give all of us, collectively, any ground to stand on from which we can demand others follow the same facts because we say so. That's Hume's tried and true claim, and it still gets a lot of attention today. Ises are just ises. You can't ought an is. So that's the foundation of this moral view from nowhere that MacIntyre talked about later. Anytime someone says, a human is a creature who enjoys living the good life, an is statement, therefore we ought to maximize the ability of all humans to live the good life, an ought statement, anytime someone does that, They're just smuggling in morality and acting like it's just there, even though it's only there based on the speaker's personal positionality, their perspective on life. If this sounds weird, think about how a super conservative, super traditional Christian who's been led to believe the Bible is the literal and unfailing Word of God, think about how they might hear me say something like, we ought to make it easy for everyone to live the good life, and they disagree. They might say God's rules are much more important, and anyway, it's clear from the Bible that morality isn't even something humans can ever figure out, so instead of trying, we ought to just go with God, an ought statement, because God is the creator of the universe, an is statement. It's probably easier to see already that an is statement cannot lead to an ought statement, but it sure will feel like it obviously does to the Christian who's talking to me, or for that matter, for anyone who's talking to me about their personal morals. Now imagine I'm a Christian white man living in Mississippi in 1800. What Hume's actually saying is that I can't say, look, things just are the way they are. I was born into a world where slavery is legal and expected, where white supremacy is the law of the land, where indigenous folks are being slaughtered to make way for white people who want to press westward, and where my pastor keeps telling me that I was born with white skin because God loves me more than people of color and because he thinks I'm special. Manifest destiny, baby. I guess since this is the way things are, I ought to own slaves, kill indigenous people, or maybe lock my wife in the house while I'm at it, because the Constitution didn't give her any rights at all. Hume, and probably you, can easily spot the problems with this reasoning, this getting oughts from ises. But if I really lived back then with the rest of the ises that existed then, I probably wouldn't be able to spot this issue in real time because the world then would be the only world I've ever known. And in that world, I wouldn't be able to do moral math based on a 2026 world where equality is valued in many circles and where racism is usually frowned on. I mean, how would I even do that? As far as 1800s Ben knows, that world doesn't exist. It's not a thing. So my ought would be based on ises that are one day going to expire. They're going to be labeled immoral by our great-great-grandchildren in less than 100 years. So speaking in 1800, I would feel like my moral math was sound, that my ises did suggest oughts, and that anyone who challenged me was likely taking a moral stance. Abolish slavery? What kind of evil idiot would even suggest that? You need a better reason to decide what you ought to do than what is. Now, another way to look at this from a much more contemporary angle is religion. Why should we practice monogamy? Because my holy book or my God or my pastor told me to, and I think I'll be punished if I don't act according to those same sources. Is that a moral argument? No. Not unless you think being punished is always the only way immorality has been dealt with, or unless you think breaking rules is immoral no matter what. And most people don't actually think either one of those things. There are plenty of laws that turn out to be immoral, and there are plenty of people who get punished for doing things that aren't immoral at all. Plus, sometimes breaking the law is a straight-up moral choice. I mean, if the Gestapo comes to your door asking for Jews in 1939, if ICE comes to your door asking for Latino people today, how fucked up is it that I can even say that in the land of the free? But that's Christian nationalism for you. And it's yet another topic for another episode. Anyway, if ICE or the German Gestapo is at your door asking for people who they want to put in concentration camps, suddenly our math would change, and most of us could easily spot the possibility of being punished is actually a sign that our actions are moral, not immoral, and that the system we're living in, the ises of our era, they're fucked up. They lead to bad oughts. Morality in this case would demand we lie, deceive, even betray our country if we want to protect the Jewish or Latino people who are in our homes. Hume has a point. Throughout history, all the way back to the Old Testament times, we can see that people have shitty morals that they swore were good morals, and that they got those shitty morals from turning is statements, like God's the rule maker, slavery is legal, into moral ought statements, like one ought to follow biblical commands, or we ought to own slaves. There's more to this, and I could actually mine this all the way down to the ises that aren't man-made, like humans require food or gravity is a force. These ises also suggest we ought to do certain things. But like Hume said, they all require us to make leaps that aren't actually part of the natural rational thought process. They require us to come to bad conclusions. But wait, Sam Harris, and me, we say not so fast, Davy Hume. Maybe there is a way to get an ought from an is, or at least to do something similar enough to that to give us a universal foundation for morality instead of everyone gets to choose their own version like we kind of live with today. We may still be using is statements to derive therefore we ought to claims, but as long as our endpoint is universally accepted or incredibly close to universally accepted, and as long as it leaves us capable of dealing with the real is-ought problem, that humans are generally idiots who fuck up so bad that every 100 years or so we have to update the list of rules along with the list of people who we thought were good guys who we now see as moral monsters. Well, if you can find a starting position that accounts for both of those human problems with every is-ought claim and brings us all to the same page, then you might have a leg to stand on when trying to establish universal morality. The way Sam Harris describes this is that we have to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps at some point to find a place that we can all agree to start on the moral problem as a group. And that's not as hard as you might think. I mean, whether you're a Christian, an atheist, a Muslim, a Scientologist, a Democrat, a Republican, a capitalist, an anarchist, or anyone else who has the ability to use rational thought, you probably recognize that you're a conscious creature. You, and apparently all other humans, share this connection as a species, the one thing that unites everyone regardless of our background. And it gives us a great place to build a version of morality that can be universal and updated as humans learn more information to avoid the historical habit of being seen as monsters in 100 years. So conscious experience, what's that like? To keep it simple, it's an experience that has two poles, two extremes, with tons of space in the middle. And those two poles could be described as well-being and extreme suffering. Well-being is a universally enjoyable experience that is always preferable to conscious creatures when compared to suffering. And even though the idea of well-being might vary from person to person, there are a lot of things that we can check off the list for the most part that will always fall into the category of suffering as long as it's conscious creatures we're talking about. And we should add here that this version of morality includes all conscious creatures, not just humans, because it was built on our experience as conscious creatures, which, as far as we know, is something that all conscious creatures experience, at least when it comes to the extreme edges of experience, that well-being and suffering thing. As Thomas Nagel said, what it is like to be a bat is very different than what it's like to be a human. But both have this conscious experience, as far as we can tell, and both are capable of experiencing both ultimate suffering and death, and both are capable of experiencing ultimate well-being, although both of those would be different for a human than they would be for a bat. All of this forms the basis of universal morality. Now, of course, it's just a starting point, and this is a short podcast, so I'm not getting too deep into it here. I probably will in the future. It's not some end-all be-all. And even if we started building our culture to embrace this version of morality and to maximize well-being for as many conscious creatures as possible while minimizing suffering for the same, we'd still have a lot of work to do because, well, for one, this is a really complicated process when you take into account how many people are impacted by, say, me buying a cheeseburger today. The workers, the farmers, the bankers, the homeless guy outside who can't afford it, and maybe even me, depending on my health. And of course, also you got to take into account what we actually know about cheeseburgers and the system that lets us buy and sell them. So for that first chunk, how does this actually impact every conscious creature on Earth? Oh boy. We have to consider how living in a world where cheeseburgers are sold impacts all of us. Is well-being increased in such a world? Whose well-being? Is the well-being of anything conscious decreased? The cow? The factory worker who cuts his hand off, keeping the burgers cheap? In what ways are well-being and suffering altered when I buy a fucking cheeseburger? And here we're going to bleed over into the second concern we would be focused on if we built the system this way, the updates in our knowledge that will certainly change this system over time. Like if, for example, we find tomorrow that we've been wrong about cheeseburgers all along and that my double-double is actually the healthiest snack on earth, and if we simultaneously discover a way to create double-doubles without killing cows, conscious creatures, while also discovering a way to keep the cows who are currently scheduled to be killed living happily somewhere, to not, say, starve them to death slowly or make their lives miserable, well then our moral system will have been updated based on this new information to recognize that the act of eating a cheeseburger is not only acceptable, but maybe a positive moral thing. The point is that we don't have to take a moral view from nowhere to find a moral starting point. We can instead just take the position we all fucking find ourselves in. Conscious experience. We're conscious creatures. And we can take what we know about that, which will also inevitably continue to be updated with new discoveries, and we can build our foundation on it. We might be wrong at times. That's built into our moral system. But we can't just sit in bed all day and not do anything, paralyzed by the fear of developing the wrong moral system. Humans don't work that way. We're operating on morals one way or the other. We all find a moral foundation, so building one that invites every conscious creature to the round table of moral definition seems like a pretty universal starting point, and it uses is to get there. I am a conscious creature. So what about monogamy? Well, plug that into this system and add the updates to our information, our birth control methods, our ideological systems of thought, our religions, all of it, and where you're left standing is where I started. Although if you have an argument I've missed, feel free to email me and let me know. You end up with a bunch of repressed people with ancient, outdated emotional reactions reinforced by patriarchal culture, controlling each other's sexuality and convincing themselves it's moral to do so. You end up with forced monogamy, and like Freud said, you also end up with a bunch of repressed, frustrated, neurotic people who manage to convince themselves that they want to be monogamous even when they don't. And Nietzsche's laughing all the way, because like he explained a long time ago, the Ubermensch, the Superman, that's the human that will eventually come along who will recognize that evolution and culture have both given us some pretty shitty gifts, including neurotic monogamy, that we may have had some reason for a long time ago. Perhaps they provided a survival benefit, but that we've long since outgrown, despite their persistence in sticking around, annoying us, and making our lives less enjoyable, decreasing our well-being. Now back to the smartass lecturing me on morality. What I should have said to him was all of the things I just said. I should have asked him how he decides on his morals, because here's the cool thing about this moral system I just outlined. It's actually the system most people try to use most of the time right now without realizing it. When you see a dog run into the road and you hit your brakes and swerve, you do that to minimize the suffering of a conscious creature, the dog who you might hit, the witness who you might traumatize, the price you might have to pay to fix your car, the family who might otherwise lose their dog, your potential emotional pain, all of it. When you get a job offer in another city, but then you consider your kids and their friends and your partner or your church, you're doing the same math. We don't always do it well. We're humans with a very limited perspective. But this is generally how most of us do this most of the time. We approach the world like this right now. Although again, we tend to do a really bad job because we don't put it into words, and we usually don't even try to hold ourselves accountable to it. So that's what I should have said to this guy. Of course, from there we probably would have descended into a conversation that made everyone else walk away about Nietzsche or Nazis or religion or some other system morality that most people adopt or claim to adopt as guides to their moral decisions, but that didn't happen. Instead, they called the first session of the day, and I spent the next few weeks thinking about what I should have said. Which brings me to two concluding points. Number one, we are all idiots. Seriously, if you know somebody who thinks they're smart, if you think this podcast offers intelligent ideas and views that help you navigate the world, you may be right and wrong at the same time. Humans are really bad at determining reality, but you'll remember that the system I outlined, which does derive an ought from it is, but only by leaning hard on the fact that all humans share an experience that ought to dictate how we go about living our lives, that system includes mechanisms for dealing with human stupidity. It allows for, it demands, updates based on new information. It demands we change our minds when we find new facts or have new experiences that show us we've been wrong or not quite right all along. Second, drugs. Don't you love these episodes where I sneak that in at the end? It's kind of the story of my life. Our drug policy is stuck in the past, rehashing century-old excuses for attacking, stigmatizing, and pushing out anyone who struggles with addiction. And in many ways, those who use drugs and don't struggle with addictions. I'm pretty non-addicted right now, but that stigma still comes at me every time I have to take a drug test to teach in prisons, or when I get dirty looks at a conference because I come back from break baked and smelling like skunk ass. We know that drug use is always an attempt to change one's conscious experience, and we know that how we treat somebody when they're using impacts their future. If we push them out and disconnect them from their social support groups, for example, we know that they're more likely to fall headlong into addiction, to reduce their well-being and the well-being of their family, who now has to deal with this person's addiction getting worse. It's long past time we updated our morality when it comes to drugs and drug users, and that we admit we've been those monsters from the past who did things that someday people will look at and think, what the fuck were y'all thinking? Why would you treat people like that? The sooner we change that, the better. Love yourselves and the addicted people in your life. I'm Ben Boyce.
You love the doll, but what if I told you that was the only doll you were allowed to play with the rest of your life? How would you feel?
Sad.
You'd feel sad, of course, because there's a lot of other dolls on your shelves. And if you play with the other dolls, you can't have that doll anymore. Even though that doll doesn't really want to play with you at this point. You're both living a lie. There's other dolls you like.